Hello, my name is Gail and I'm going to read you a book today called Curious George by H.A. Ray. It's a favorite here in the United States and I hope that you're going to enjoy it. So as I said, the book is called Curious George and there's little George and a yellow hat. This is George. He lived in Africa. He was a good little monkey and always very curious. One day, George saw a man. He had on a large yellow hat. The man saw George, too. What a nice little monkey. I'd like to take him home with me. He put his hat on the ground, and George was very curious. So he came down from the tree to look at the yellow hat. The hat had been on the man's head. So George thought it would be nice to have it on his own head. And so he put the hat on his head. He couldn't see. It covered his whole face. The man picked him up quickly and put him into a bag. So there's George with the hat on, and then there's George in the bag. The man with the big yellow hat put George into a little boat, and they rowed across the water to a big ship. George was sad, but he was still a little curious. On the big ship, things began to happen. The man took off the bag. George sat on a little stool, and the man said, "George, I'm going to take you to a big zoo in a big city. You'll like it there. Now run along and play and don't get into trouble." George promised to be good, but it is easy for little monkeys to forget. On the deck, he found some seagulls. He wondered how they could fly. He was very curious. Finally, he had to try. It looked easy, but oh no, what happened to George? First, he's flying through the air, and then splash, there he goes, right into the water. Poor George. "Where is George?" everyone asked. The sailors looked and looked. At last they saw him struggling in the water. See, there's George stuck in the water. And he was almost all tired out. The sailors cried, "Man overboard!" as they threw him a life belt. George caught it and held on. At last he was safe on board. After that, George was more careful to be a good monkey, and until at last the trip was over. George said goodbye to all the kind sailors, and he and the man with the yellow hat walked off the ship, onto the shore, and into the city, to the man's house. And after he had a nice meal and a good pipe, George felt tired. There's George, dressed in the man's blue and white pajama shirt. So George lays down in bed and he falls asleep. There's George all asleep. The next morning, the man telephoned the zoo. George watched him. He was fascinated. And then the man went away. George was curious. He wanted to use the telephone. So he dialed 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Uh-oh, ding-a-ling, ding-a-ling. George had telephoned the fire station. The firemen rushed to the phone. "Hello, hello," but there was no answer. They looked on a big map that showed where the telephone call had come from. They didn't know it was George. They thought it was a real fire. "Hurry, hurry, hurry." The firemen jumped on the fire engines, onto the hook and ladders, and they rushed. Everyone out of the way. "Hurry, hurry, hurry." They thought they were going to a fire. And they rushed into the house, but there was no fire, only a naughty little monkey. Catch him," they cried. George tried to run away. He almost did, but he got caught in the telephone wire. And the big fireman and the little fireman caught him, and they took him out. You fooled the fire department, they said. We will have to shut you up and put you into prison. So there's George in prison all by himself, and he wanted to get out. He climbed up to the window to try the bars, and just then the watchman came. He got on the wooden bed to catch George, but he was too heavy, and the bed tipped over, and the watchman fell over, and George ran out the door. See George leaving. He hurried through the building, and now he was very glad that he was a monkey, because he walked on the telephone wires. Quickly and quietly over the guard's head, George walked away. He was free. And down the street, outside the prison walls, he saw a balloon man. A little girl bought a balloon for her brother, and George watched. He was curious. He wanted a red balloon. He reached over and tried to help himself. But when he grabbed the balloon, by accident, the whole bunch broke loose, and in an instant, the wind whisked them all away, with George holding tight with both hands. So there goes George up into the sky. Up he sailed, higher and higher. And the houses looked like toy houses, and George was very frightened. He held on very, very tight. He landed on top of a traffic light. Everyone was surprised. The traffic got all mixed up. George didn't know what to do, and then he heard someone call, "George!" He looked down and he saw his friend, the man with the yellow hat. He was so happy to see the man. And George slid down the post, and the man put him under his arm. And then he paid for the balloon, and he took George into a car, and at last, away they went with all the balloons. I bet George felt happy then. And they drove away, and you know where they went? They went to the zoo, where George had a nice place to live. And that's the story of Curious George. As I said, it's a favorite story here in the United States, and I hope you all enjoyed it. Have a nice day.